Well, welcome to CyberViews. I'm Dan Hadaway, and in today's episode, we're going to be kind of circling back around to the subject of AI, and with a little bit of a twist, because I have a friend. His name's Bill Arnold, and he has been involved in AI since the 1990s. Now, he was there when we first started getting serious about AI, even though it was first started in like the 40s or 50s.
1956. So Marvin Minsky put together a conference in 1956. And that is where artificial intelligence was first talked about. So in the late 1955, he started talking about it and coined the term artificial intelligence. The conference was held in 1956. And that is where the first sort of group of people got together and said, can we do something that, mimics human intelligence in computing?
And was that kind of matching up with Robbie Robot and some of the movies at the time? Or, what
it was, the state of computing, and we can get into this more later on, but the state of computing was, there wasn't a state of computing at the time. The problems that we have in the sort of the history of AI are repeatable problems in the sense that we recognize that there's a constraint. Then we have advances that get us to the point where we're now up against a new constraint. And then things fall off while we solve the other constraint issues. And then the programs catch up. And, so there's been a couple of waves. But, there was a big funding sort of from 55 to around 74. There was a lot of funding put in. Then there was sort of a malaise where things didn't really happen for a while. And then there was a burst up again that there was about a big U.S. government put about $400 million into a bunch of thought about what we could do with AI. And in about 1987, 88, actually, I guess around 1990, they actually pulled the plug on that whole funding. So we went into what was called the AI winter. Like there was no new investment. And until really around 93, which incidentally coincides with when I got my master's in artificial intelligence, 1993, not that I caused the end of AI winter, but just coincidentally, the time I was coming out.
Bill's getting a master's in it. We ought to start investing in it then. Yeah.
But that's actually, so then things started up again. And, again, there were some constraints that got hit. And then in around 2000, things fell down a little bit. And, it's just a constant wave. Yeah, I'm sure we'll get into all this later.
I really appreciate the correction of my introduction, Bill, but let's kind of circle back around to it. And so as everybody already has figured out, Bill Arnold's a friend of mine who has a master's in artificial intelligence in 1993. Yeah. That's when we were all like learning to use CompuServe and Naperville, right? Now, treating RAM as a commodity. That's kind of, at least that's what I remember about it. Now, a lot of our audience wasn't even alive in 1993. But tell me about yourself. I understand you have a degree in philosophy. Just kind of give us your resume, the high level resume.
Yeah. So my resume at a high level is I've done a whole lot of things, and it's sometimes hard to see the connection between them. Yes. And so realistically, so we already alluded to the fact that, right, artificial intelligence was first used as a term in 1955. The first time I heard it was in 1991. So 1991, early in the year, I was in a situation, right? So I was working for the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation at the time. Nice. And I was resolving the assets of failed savings and loans. That was my job at the time. I'd been a banker. I'd worked for a savings and loan. I'd done some investment banking work. I do have a bachelor's that emphasizes philosophy, but my high school work was all science, very much science driven, science connected. I grew up just in the shadow of the NASA Space Center in Florida. So a lot of scientific, sort of education. I got a degree that was focused mostly in philosophy. So small liberal arts college, came out, in 1981, there was not a Starbucks on every corner, so I couldn't get a job with a philosophy degree. So I went to grad school for a couple of years, decided that wasn't my gig, went into banking, ended up at the FDIC. And really, it was the point in time where we were just starting to put computer networks on our desks, right? 1989, 90. I went to work for this office at the FDIC, and they brought a enormous box computer and put it on my desk and said, here's your computer. It runs DOS, but we've got this green screen network application so that you can access the databases in DC. And my response to that was I went and got my 5.25-inch floppies of Windows and brought them and installed them on the computer because there was no security whatsoever. And then I brought my own copy of WordPerfect and loaded it on the computer. And then I could work. I had Windows. I had WordPerfect. I could do what my job was. I could do my job in about half a day a week at that point. And so the rest of the time was sort of free for me to help other people figure out what they were doing with these computers on their desks. And so that's what I did.
So organically became the help desk guy for the FDIC.
Yeah. And then I asked them if I could move over into the computing field. And they said, as the federal government is likely to do, you lack the requisite academic qualifications for the job that you are applying for. And that is how I ended up pursuing a degree in artificial intelligence. Because the only requisite degree I could get other than a master's in artificial intelligence was a master's in computer science. But you can't get into a Master of Computer Science program, at least you couldn't in 1990, without having a bachelor's in computer science.
Yeah.
So I was stuck. And I found I was leafing through the graduate school program from the graduate school bulletin from the University of Georgia. And I came across this description of a program that included, it was a multidisciplinary program that included economics, computer science, psychology, especially cognitive psychology, individuals from the business school, from the College of Agriculture. So they had put together an institute at the University of Georgia that was in the Franklin, I think it's called the Franklin School of Arts and Sciences there, the graduate school. And that's where the institute was. And it was headed by a guy who was the department head for the Department of Philosophy at the college. You have to understand that a big part of the work from in the 60s and 70s that sort of fed into AI was around symbolic logic, like representing things symbolically and then trying to reason about them. And that's where this guy, Donald Newt was his name, Don wanted to kind of advance this whole idea of logic programming. And that's how he got involved in artificial intelligence, was this idea that we think logically, we make decisions logically. How could we programmatically represent that decisioning process?
Nice. So, well, I just, in preparation for this, Bill, I asked ChatGPT, what are the branches of science that involve, the development of artificial intelligence? And like second to the last, it came back with like 8 branches of science. And by the way, it didn't seem like it was lying to me, but second to the last was philosophy and ethics is the category that it came back with. And it makes sense to me. Logic is a huge part of philosophy, right?
Yeah, in the master's program, you actually had to take a master's level class in logic, not in the logic programming, but in logic itself over in the Department of Philosophy, as well as a class in, you'll love this, philosophy of mind, right? The whole idea of how does consciousness come into being separate from, sort of the wetware, the brain and all the neurons and all that. Like, what does it mean to think? What is a mind at all? We were very philosophical in our approach to artificial intelligence at the time.
And it wasn't more
reasons for that. We didn't have any computer hardware, so that was a big part of it.
when did neural networks first start being discussed? The application of math in, in what we now call artificial intelligence. Was that right from the start? Is that?
Yeah, there was a pretty early connection to neural networks. When I got to the program in 1991, there were already people doing neural network work, right? So this program that I entered, they only allowed in basically a dozen people a year. I was the 25th graduate from this program, this Master of Science in Artificial Intelligence. It's still an ongoing institute at the University of Georgia. And so there were already people doing neural network work. There was a lot of work being done. You have to understand that at this time, right, the field was very broad. It's actually much narrower now than it used to be, because there was at the highest level, there was a split between people who were trying to make computers do things. And there was another sense in which there were people who were trying to use a computer to understand how humans do things. And those are sort of two broadly different applications or process areas in artificial intelligence, philosophically. So if you think about all the different things that could fit into those various categories, right? There's a whole field that kind of came in right around 1980, was this notion of expert systems. So ways to program computers so that they could take the place of an expert. That actually, I think, so that activity in 1980 actually leads us sort of very directly to where we are today, because the idea is that we get more and more expertise. And that's really what a lot of the artificial intelligence, up until about 2 years ago, most of the AI work was around really trying to get deeper and deeper into one area of specific activity, right? I mean, just like PhDs are about doing more specificity to something, not more breadth, right?
Let's drill down into that just a little bit more. We always hear about AGI versus narrow artificial intelligence, or whatever the buzzwords are that the people are using. Can you kind of articulate the difference a little bit, at least from your perspective?
Yeah, I think so. So, here's one way to think about it, Dan, would be this, right? If I have general intelligence at the level of a 3-year-old, having only seen 2 or 3 dogs and a dozen cats, I can tell you which one is which, right? If I have a 3-year-old and I say, is this a dog or a cat? They will be able to tell me it's a dog or a cat. A computer who has only seen that many instances of a thing through a neural network is probably not going to be able to identify which is which. But if you give it 100,000 pictures of a cat, it can tell you if the picture is a cat. It also may not be able to tell you whether or not the cat is an actual cat when you see one walking around, as opposed to a picture of a cat. They're not actually looking at the reality of what's going on. They're looking at a picture that they're then manipulating to be able to produce a result. Whereas we interface with the world directly, right? And so when you're looking at a general intelligence, you can analogize from things you've seen to things you haven't seen. So I know that if a 22-wheeled vehicle comes down my road, I understand the physics of what's going to happen with that vehicle. It's a vehicle. I can analogize from an 18-wheeler that I just saw, and a 16-wheeler, and a 10-wheeler, and a 4-wheeler, and a 2-wheeler as to what that's going to do, right?
But at its basic core, I think what you're saying is we can teach a computer what a cat is, but then when we show it a dog, it can say that's not a cat.
That's all it can
say it looks like a dog.
Yeah, right. It can't say, oh, well, it has to have a broad range. One of the things that, so if you're an AGI person, and I fall in that camp, I'm a person who's very interested. So when I was studying philosophy, the area I was most interested in was epistemology. And epistemology is, how do we know? What does it mean to know something? How do we know something? How do we acquire knowledge? If you know me now, it makes perfect sense that that's what I would have been interested in then. And it applies to my artificial intelligence stuff too.
Actually, Bill, just so you know, I think you're the first person I've heard this phrase from that we hear a lot now in cybersecurity, which is we don't know what we don't know. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I mean, we heard that during, the reaction to 9/11 and everything, but I feel like I heard that from you before I even heard it then.
Because there are so many things that we don't know, right? And one of the things that we have to guard against is the notion that computers actually know things. They don't. They manipulate symbols, data, bits and bytes, and make comparisons between those things. They don't know that there's any like that. They don't know. They don't know that they're comparing an animal with an animal. Like they don't have any, unless it's fed to them. They don't have any notion of the physics of the world. They don't feel gravity. They don't perceive what it means to get hit in the face with a ball when you're playing football. They don't, right? There are things that computers cannot know that are part of the human experience because they don't have a being that can experience those things. So that makes it really very tricky for them to know what truth is, right? So you made the point earlier about, you asked ChatGPT something, and it seemed like it wasn't lying to you.
Yes.
But if you asked it to cite links and it gave you links, if you're using, say, ChatGPT 3.5, it's a pretty good likelihood that when you click on those links, you're going to get a 404, file not found.
Yeah.
So, it doesn't understand it. It has absorbed an enormous amount of textual data, right? That is what ChatGPT has. It has access to text on the internet and, trying to make correlations between things. But it doesn't necessarily have an evaluation function that says that's right, or that matches reality, or that's the truth. Well, and this will go in a weird direction here, but what humans have is we have built-in evaluation functions. When I raised my children, one of the things that my wife and I used to always talk about was natural consequences of behavior, right? Child does something and the world does something back. And so
I love that way of looking at it.
So when you think about that, that's just an evaluation function. And in AI, an evaluation function is something that tells you whether or not the result is reasonable. Right? Is this an actual result that has meaning and is valuable for the direction that we're trying to go in? And you have to provide some evaluation function. There is no evaluation function for most AI systems, unless they're embedded in a robotic body. If you're just talking about an AI computational system, it doesn't have any feedback mechanism. It could just as likely be true to an AI that the world is flat, unless it actually goes and does all the math to figure out that these things couldn't be true in a flat world, but they are true in a spherical world, But just given a bunch of data that sort of equally supports the two ideas, it wouldn't be able to know one way or the other. It's never seen the sun set beyond the horizon.
Yeah, I feel this is why, to me, I realize that AI will be able to replace bad art, but AI will never know. One of the things that Bill and I have in common is we have children who are artists, and the look in the eye of that person on Tommy's book cover, you could tell that Tommy knew what fear was, right? Mm-hmm. And AI doesn't have the ability yet, at least, to know what fear is. I don't know how to put it other than there's a complete difference between good art and AI art, in my opinion. Even the stuff that, looks good to people that don't understand art, in my opinion.
I think it's the visceral piece, right? It's the human body reaction. Like, how does a computer look at a person and assess the emotive piece of what's going on in that person? The nuances are so small. Can they eventually learn that? As an identification piece, right? We all know identification is easier than creation, right? So can I see fear in your eye? Yes. can I create the look of fear in your eye without knowing what fear really feels like? It just doesn't seem rational and reasonable to me. So yeah, I don't think we're gonna stop having great art. I think we're gonna have a proliferation of mediocre art. And that's happened at other times, right? The printing press did that. We were able to recreate pieces of art, and send them everywhere. Well, instead of just paintings and that kind of thing. So there are always these watershed moments, and then one of my favorite sort of mottos in the whole world is it's not what happens, it's how you react to it that makes a difference. Yeah. So, the question will be, how will artists react to that, right? And they'll be pushed to another level to not be the people who create mediocre art. So,
agreed.
Yeah.
I feel like we ought to kind of circle back a little bit to, the origins of AI. I love it how we kind of start following some of these trails, but what was your thesis when you were taking your master's degree?
Yeah, so one of the areas that was really hot at the time that I came into the program, and of course, that in 1991, the only place that had the internet was academia. There was no commercial internet. Nobody outside of academics had access to it. Most of its utilization was just complete garbage. So Usenet news groups were, the big thing. That's where people had, those were chat rooms, right? It was just a weird world. So the only reason I bring that up is because what was hot was sort of localized to what was of interest to the researchers at your particular university, right? It wasn't necessarily, like today, we know everything that's happening everywhere, which means we really don't know much of anything because there's so much availability. And again, we don't have those filtering functions. If I had a good evaluation function for everything that came in from the internet, I would, 99% of it would just fall on the floor and I'd never look at it. But instead, stuff just hits me all the time. So at my institution, at the University of Georgia, there was a very strong group that was working on something called genetic algorithms. Now, I haven't worked in genetic algorithms in almost 30 years, and neither has anybody else. Let's say that there's a problem and there's an answer space, right? So there's all these potential answers to whatever the problem is. And you have a sort of a search algorithm that's looking for an answer in this section over here. And you have another algorithm that's searching for an answer over here. And for whatever reason, they both end up constrained and they're never breaking out of their search areas. You take part of this algorithm and part of this algorithm and you breed them to produce an algorithm that has more breadth. And so you're constantly trying to sort of use the idea of sort of the survival of the fittest. What can produce the best results according to your evaluation criteria, right? So you're feeding it, evaluate and saying, oh yeah, you're looking there. But for whatever reason, they get hamstrung. You can breed new algorithms for how to do this. And then you provide them the search space and they go across things and you eventually say, oh, turns out you're a 6 and we really need you to be a 10. So look, you're a 6 and you're a 7. We're going to breed you 2 and see if we can at least get an 8, and so you're constantly trying to breed an algorithm that will narrow in on this is the actual answer you're looking for. Okay. That sounds very esoteric. It sounds very weird, but actually, it works.
To me, it sounds a little bit like where neural network weighting, I mean.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
There's sort of two different things. And the neural network world really had a lot more. I would say that neural networks benefit from a couple of things. One of the things neural networks benefit from is that we conceptualize them as similar to what goes on in our heads, right? So we have this idea about neurons. We have an idea about them, the synapses and the connections between everything. And so we go, oh, this is like that. Whereas a genetic algorithm is more like the whole world. Like it's like we're trying to breed a new species as opposed to we're trying to narrow in on a solution to a specific problem, right? Because the genetic algorithms also become sort of the basis for an area of research called artificial life. which is how can you mimic the idea of evolution in intelligence, right? And have that sort of, you're using genetic algorithms on a specific problem, but you can also be using sets of genetic algorithms and breeding them with other sets of genetic algorithms inside of theoretically a species, right? That whole area didn't really lead anywhere. I don't feel like, there was a lot of work done on that area in the early 90s, and it didn't really pan out in the way that most people expected to. Meanwhile, neural networks have the great benefit of, so they were coming up at the same time. So it wasn't very long after that Google started coming along.
Yep.
And what Google gave us was data sets, right? Suddenly there were enormous sets of data available to us via the internet, right? So again, the data part, super important. The ability to train a neural network is, just based on a lot of data has to be available. You don't have a lot. And so you have to kind of wonder, right? A human baby does not have access to all those pieces of data, right? So how do they learn so incredibly quickly and incredibly well compared to how much data we have to give a computer for it to learn one little thing like that's a cat, right? So I wonder about that all the time. So one of the things I think about is evaluation functions and the fact that children have strongly weighted evaluators, right? So they have typically parents who are giving them strong evaluation. That's the wrong way to go. This is the right way to go. That's not the way to think about that. This is the way to think about that, right? And if you, like me, there are specific things my father said to me when I was a little boy that just show up in my head all the time. And so they're, not only are they super strong, but they focus us in a particular direction. Like we grow in a particular way because of the evaluation functions that have been applied to us early in our lives. We also have the real world, which is constantly providing a real strong evaluation function. If you, fall off the roof or jump off the roof and break your leg, that is a very strong evaluation function that says jumping off roofs is not a thing you should do. I would just like to note that I never broke my leg by jumping off the roof, but because somebody will see this and go like, oh my God, but I never did that. But those functions, in order for an AI system to do the same thing, there needs to be human interaction that creates those evaluation functions that says you're tuning in the right direction or you're tuning in the wrong direction. If you there was an experiment several years ago where an AI system was introduced to Twitter, and there became a Twitter bot that was AI based. It became racist. It became misogynistic.
Yeah.
It became the loudest voices. It became the loudest voices, which is not necessarily good, right? That's not necessarily, from my perspective at least, those are not the values that I would want to see an artificial intelligence have. I will just say that if we let artificial intelligence just go blindly down any one of these paths, we're all doomed.
Well, that's kind of, I feel like that's what I'm starting to get a feel for in talking to you, Bill, is that it seems to me like, you were part of a fork in terms of approaches and there might have been other prongs, but at least the two I'm aware of now are neural networks and genetic algorithm development. And it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but neural networks end up becoming a lot easier for them as big data arose to be more successful, and that we were able to get a better return on our investment from that approach. But I'm from the video business, and I happen to know that beta was a much better format than video, even though video was much more successful. And eventually completely, no one has beta, or, no one had beta machines when we sold our company in the mid 90s. Right. And so it seems like there's probably a lot of prongs of that fork dropped. And now we're down to language models, neural network, what we're down to, right?
Yeah.
Are we making a mistake as a species to not return to some of those earlier forks? Or, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I don't even know if it's a return to the earlier forks as much as it is, more exploration of other areas. And you see some work, the place I think the most interesting work is being done now is on the combination of artificial intelligence with robotics, right? So because those are things that are going to have serious applications for usefulness, I think, in ways that replace labor, for instance, in places where we don't have good labor pools. For instance, if I can produce a robot that actually will do what migrant labor is doing for us now on the farms, that would be a very positive thing, right? Because the reality is that we have labor shortages. We don't have a shortage. We don't have much of a shortage of knowledge workers, but we do have a shortage of, when was the last time that you were in a shop that, is closing early because they don't have anybody to fill the shift? It happens
yesterday.
Yeah, happens to me weekly. Weekly, I run into something where there's something isn't available that has previously been available, where a store owner of some kind has a business model that expects them to be able to earn revenue during a particular time. And they aren't earning revenue during that time because they can't find anybody to help them produce that revenue. Robotics can solve some of those problems, right? And also, those are all constrained environments, right? So there's not an expectation that robot needs to interact in the whole world. It just needs to interact in some. It's just like we've done with neural networks and with other kinds of programs, where we've gotten narrower and narrower. Right now, if I embody that narrow intelligence into a robot that is only going to act within a specific sphere, then that's great, right? Then I can actually get value out of that. I think that's a good thing. I don't think there's really I don't see any real work being done on AGI, on general intelligence. If there is, it's being done in philosophy departments, not in computer science departments.
Or I mean, again, I'm a veteran of the video business, right? I mean, to me, where you see AGI is in the movies. I mean?
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Just so you know, Terminator 2 was still a huge runner when you got your master's degree in 1993.
Yeah. And that's some scary stuff, man. There's no positive movies about general AI, right? It's never a good thing. The assumption is always that it will decide that we are just ants that need to be crushed.
But as a person with, a degree of philosophy, working in this master's degree with your thesis focused on, genetic algorithms and such, did we think about ethics and, bias and that sort of thing back in the early 90s? Or was that something that we started learning because of what we saw with Twitter and that sort of thing?
So I'll just say, in the degree program where we had a philosophy of mind, class that we had to take at the graduate level, we didn't have an ethics class, right? There was no ethics class as part of the work. And so at some point I alluded to the fact that I went to graduate school for a couple of years straight out of my undergrad. And that was actually seminary. I was thinking that I was going to head toward the ministry. I wanted to teach at a graduate school level. But so ethics, right? Some grounding in some ethic, I think, is an important part of all the parts of our lives. It's, I didn't leave seminary because I was an unethical person. I left because it was not a good match for me. But a lot of the same concepts, are part of my life. I think that ethical decision making is an important part of it. I don't think. I think it's really interesting. I think that what has happened is we didn't think about it at all because we honestly, in 1991, 92, 93, we were producing proof of concept work, right? My thesis, was the first implementation of a genetic algorithm in a language called Prolog. And I don't even think you can get a Prolog implementation these days. Like, that's just a language that has languished. It was a logic programming language. So we were producing everything that was just like proof of concept. Even the neural networks, like I can remember a guy that I was in school with was doing a neural network that helped in battlefield communication scenarios. So if you were setting up a communications network in a battlefield, the question would be, where should we put the transmitters, right? And so he could feed the terrain into this system, and it would come back with, these are the places where you should put your transmitters, right? Very sort of simplistic model, right? We didn't have any ability to even generalize our own thoughts to the point of, well, what if we're successful with all this, right?
Yeah.
What would that look like? We were thinking about how are decisions made, and then I think the sort of premise was, well, ethics would be an input to the how is the decision made, right? So what are the constraints on decision making is really the ethics piece, right? So you, in your evaluation function, right? Oh, here are all the potential decisions. Are there ethical ramifications? Here are the constraints. And then that becomes an evaluation function. And then, some of these solutions get killed as a result of not, meeting the ethical, guidelines. It's no different than, if you were evolving a species and it couldn't breathe oxygen, it would just die out, right? So if it didn't meet the ethic guideline, it would just not go forward, right? So, but did I know anybody at the time who was programming that?
No. Because how can you go ethically wrong trying to figure out where to put transmitters in a battlefield? I mean?
Yeah.
There's a lot of worse ethics going on there, some people would say, maybe. But Bill, this has been really great. Of course, I mean, we talked about robots. We talked about I started off talking about our species.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting how, the human species is part of what we're talking about when we talk about technology now. But what are you doing nowadays?
Well, I'm not going to go into a great bunch of detail about it, but I work for a venture capital firm, and we're working with a bunch of universities. I mean, if you look me up, you'll find it. But it's a work. But to be clear, whatever I've said or will say for the remainder of this is my own. It's my own content. Don't go after my employer for any of it. But yeah, I work for a venture capital firm, and we assess technologies at universities to determine whether or not they could be applicable to solving really big problems in the world. And if so, then we start a company to license the technology out and try to solve the problem.
And I mean, it just seems like I feel like with your background, what we've been talking about today, it seems like what a great group of principles to have weigh in on decisions like that. An understanding of ethics, an understanding of logic, an understanding of what's going to work and what's not going to work. So kudos to you for your current position, Bill. I feel like you're helping people achieve their dreams.
Thanks. I hope so. The firm that I work for was started around the idea that there are really big problems in the world. And there are a whole bunch of people in the world who would argue with us about whether or not those things are actual problems, right? So we've got a little bit of a, we're operating on our own belief structure, right? Which is that, for instance, we have to do something about climate change because otherwise there won't be a planet. And we have to do something about feeding the population of the world because it just keeps growing. And we literally cannot just continue to scale current food production and feed the number of people that we predict to be in the world in 2050. Won't happen. So we have to do something different. And so those are the kind of, guardrails that we're working on, to say, okay, well, how can we solve those problems? How can we reduce greenhouse gas emissions while also helping businesses, helping the world be more effective at, moving forward. So can I help a farmer farm better at the same time reducing water usage, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and producing more food that will feed the growing population? If we can do all that and requires that the farmer be successful, right? We can't do all that and have the farmer, not make any money. So there's a capitalist intent behind the whole thing.
Of course.
But,
it's all risk management to me, Bill. I mean, what you're really doing there is you're balancing risk, the risk of the farmer losing his position versus the risk of not having enough food versus the risk of not having enough people to help produce the food.
Yeah. And for us, to your point, Dan, risk mitigation factors into everything we do. So when we make that decision to start a company, part of that decision, what are the technology risk mitigation milestones? What are the things that we have to do to prove out the technology side? And what are the business risk mitigation milestones? What are the things we have to prove before we put more money into the company and really try to really turn the technology up, So those are very important parts of our whole process. We're very much risk mitigation people.
I'm a firm believer that all businesses are really in the business of managing risk. Yeah. And so, Bill, I really appreciate your time for CyberViews. Is there any parting words you'd like to say? I feel like you might be in the camp of, hey, chill out. It's not we're gonna be able to survive this technology too.
I'll tell you this. In 1974, Marvin Minsky said that within 8 years, we would have artificial general intelligence. That problem would be solved. In 1974, the father of artificial intelligence said it would be solved.
Optimistic about his children.
It just keeps being true, right? Here's the other part of that, right? So people are like, oh, ChatGPT, it's going to change everything. Think back just a few years to a little program called Watson. Watson beat the Jeopardy champion.
Yep.
Big Blue beat the chess champion. And when was the last time you heard of either one of them doing anything that actually was important to the world, right? Watson is now just a feature that IBM sells into other things. So the Weather Channel is now powered by Watson, but it didn't change the world.
Well, you know what I would say is a little bit different about the world now than it was before Watson. I bet there's millions more people that know how to play chess now than there was in the 90s.
Maybe if you want to see the most amazing program about artificial intelligence and its ability to operate in very constrained environments, there's a program, and I'm sorry, I didn't know I was going to mention it. I didn't look it up. It's on, I think it's on Netflix. It's about the program called AlphaGo.
AlphaGo, I've seen that. It's a great
fantastic
program.
Because the AI makes a move against a world champion playing Go.
Yep.
That everyone thinks is a mistake, and it wins the game. And that is powerful. That is an interesting thing, right? But after seeing billions of games of Go and after participating in billions of games of Go, it has one insight, which is, oh, I should do this instead of the predicted thing. Because from there, I can see a path where I could potentially, maybe, get a victory here. And it works out. And I think that's pretty amazing. And that was done through the team that did Big Blue, the one that won the chess match. So,
now, did you see the recent press about that, though, Bill, where a different team of AI specialists taught somebody who had never played the game before a tactic that the AI, didn't know, and he just stuck to that tactic, which was the AI didn't understand groups. And so he just kept surrounding the other team with, groups, and they ended up winning the game against the AI, and he had never played Go before.
No, I have not seen that, but I think it's amazing. And I think it's a perfect example of the idea that AI trains down narrower and narrower. ChatGPT only does one thing. It predicts the next word.
Yep.
And the reason that ChatGPT requires you to give it an input, you to ask a question, is that's the beginning. That gives it the first word. If you sat down with ChatGPT and just said, you go first, what would you like to talk about today? Give it a try. See what happens. I haven't tried that, but I think it would be interesting.
I really appreciate your time and this CyberViews episode. Oh, and by the way, the links to the movie, that Netflix movie that Bill had referred to, as well as the article about the person that defeated the Go AI, will be on our page at cyberviews.infotext.com.